Hey everyone, welcome to your first step in your international travel abroad experience. My name's Ben Boyce. You can call me Dr. Boyce if you want, or Ben is fine. And I'm going to be your teacher this semester. Now, this class is really set up to be an in-person learning experience, so we're going to tweak a few things with the online setup to make it a little more navigable and to make it feel a little bit more personal. So today I want to do two things real quick. Number one, just go over what to expect from this class. And then number two, go over a little bit about what we're doing here. What should we be trying to get at through these 10 weeks we're going to share together? So let's jump in. Welcome. All right, so from some basic information, all your regular first day stuff that we always try to go over the first week of class, you'll notice that my email is actually UC Denver. I teach just up the road. I actually teach occasionally at Regis University as well. My DU address works, but it sometimes doesn't forward to my CU Denver. So the email address is not a mistake. This is the same one on our Canvas module, and you can find my email address there anytime you want. I've made the mistake in the past of doing Zoom office hours at a specific time during the day, and I've noticed I don't get a lot of response, and then I'll inevitably get somebody that wants a meeting with me outside of those hours. So the good news is for us, just shoot me an email if you need to meet, and we can try to work out a time that works for both of us. So let's talk a little bit about who I am, because I take a bit different of approach to this class than maybe a lot of the other professors that you might have wound up with. I graduated from DU, good Lord, 2018. So it's been a few years now. My main focus, my PhD is in communication, but my main focus was criminal justice, criminality, and specifically the war on drugs. What's going on with this 100-year-old conflict we've been waging against ourselves that costs us tens of billions of dollars every year in tax money, hundreds of $1 billions every year that we're still spending on illegal drugs, and more than 100,000 deaths that were labeled overdose deaths last year alone. So that's my focus. And as weird as it might seem, that comes into this class a lot because the war on drugs and other institutional norms in our culture that are in the process of changing. I mean, think about how different drugs are thought of very differently today than they were just a few years ago. That gives us a way to understand our own culture and to see things that sometimes don't stand out. I also do podcasting. Got a podcast we'll talk about in just a sec. In fact, it might be the next slide. So I write. This is a paper I have in the Marshall Project. And again, you'll notice that all of my work is focused on criminal justice, prison, the war on drugs, things like that. And I also do a podcast. It's just sort of a hobby. It's free, but you're welcome to check that out if you're ever looking for some basic information on drugs. And we'll dive into it a few times this quarter, again, to try to get a different perspective on what U.S. culture really looks like from the outside and how it works. A little bit more about me. I mentioned I teach at UC Denver. I do teach on campus there, but through UC Denver's in-prison college education program, I'm one of their head educators. And then my Regis job, Regis University, also in Denver, I occasionally teach a class for them. So this is one of the prisons I teach at, Sterling Correctional. This is way up on the northern border of right next to Nebraska. And this one's down in Territorial in Canyon City. And you can see this was actually built out of the mountain behind the prison back in the early 1900s by incarcerated people. Many of the original buildings are still there. So that again informs my perspective. And again, there's an angle here that comes into class because you can look at our prison system and actually also get an interesting glimpse of how culture works in ways we don't see every day. One more piece to add to this complicated puzzle that is your teacher this quarter. I spent time in a prison back in 2005, up till about 2005. Before that, I was in and out of jail a lot. This is one of the prisons I spent time in. It's the largest walled prison on earth. It's in Jackson, Michigan. You can actually tour a few of the cell blocks now that are shut down, but the majority of the prison is still open to this day. It was opened the same year Alcatraz, or a few years before, actually. Alcatraz started housing federal inmates. So that gives you an idea of the feel of that prison. And again, we'll talk about this through the semester. I mention all this to put that out there initially as the frame that I use to look at culture, my experience, my academic interests, and then also to just let those of you know that in the future, if you're ever working on a drug project, a criminal justice project, a prison project, and you're looking for some suggestions, some citations, reach out. All right, so let's get to it. What is the point of this class? Almost always on the first day, there's a lot of people that are thinking, this is the basics. This is where I'm going to learn. How do I get on the bus at in the culture I'm going to? Or how do I talk to somebody in a way that I don't accidentally say something offensive in their culture? That's a little bit about what this class is about, but our goal is to really get you in a position where you can see that stuff for yourself in real time when you travel abroad. And to that end, this class is actually about looking at ourselves. As weird as that seems, especially if you've lived in the United States for a long time, we're an incredibly individualistic culture, and we're also an incredibly behind the scenes culture. We say a lot of things are one way, and in reality, they're another way, and it's very difficult to get us to acknowledge that we've got this cognitive dissonance. And that leaves many of us in a position in the United States to feel like, what is culture? What is my culture? Who am I culturally? And in fact, an interesting trick I often do in in-person classes on the first day is to say, what do you think culture is? What do you think US culture is? And we usually end up with a list of things that are probably popping into your mind right now. Light beer, McDonald's, NASCAR, big league sports. We do have an identity as a US culture, but it's really hard to get our hands on it. And a big part of the reason is exactly what I just said. Much of it is kind of shallow, at least on the exterior surface, when we're talking fast food and explosions in movies, right? Those are things that really, they're great, but they're not some sort of historic bulwark that we can be proud of. So how does the rest of the world see us? There's lots of ways to go about looking at this. Many of you are going to get abroad and find out, though, that what we talk about here is exactly how the rest of the world sees us. They don't see us as a beacon on a hill anymore, necessarily. Most of them see us as sort of refusing to look in the mirror, like I was saying before, about our own cultural identities. We're seen as guns being everywhere because those are news stories that when they are generated in other countries, where guns aren't as normal as here, most countries, they're shocking. They're out of the norm. And so they stick in the minds of people from other cultures that the US culture has guns everywhere. Now, another example, this is a MDMA pill that was sold on the street. And you'll notice MDMA pill, this one and almost all MDMA pills are stamped with funky labels. And this makes sense if you think about capitalism. Nikes have a swoosh on them because it associates it with something in our mind that makes us feel like it identifies us. And of course, drug producers realize they want to mark their products as different than the next guy's. So if somebody buys your pill and loves it and then takes another one that's the same color and it doesn't work, they don't think they both came from the same spot. Now, how did they decide how to mark these pills? Well, they looked from afar and said, what does US culture strike us as from where we're at in Indonesia or from parts of China or from different places where these drugs are actually synthetically manufactured from the precursors? And what they saw, as you can see in this pill, is Mitsubishi. And a lot of times you'll see all sorts of other name brands on ecstasy tablets, MDMA tablets. Again, just another example that if you look close, you can pick up clues about, number one, how we see ourselves in the world, what is our real cultural identity, and then two, how does the rest of the world see us when they're looking from the outside? Now think about some of the undercurrents in US culture, as I've already mentioned. Proud to be an American. This is the greatest country in the earth, right? Those are things that are common patriotic sayings that often don't have what feels to me like the rest of that sentence. The United States is the greatest culture in the earth at, because we're not the greatest at everything. I mean, it's not hard to get on, you're all on computers right now, to open a side window and Google what is the infant mortality rate in the United States and have your heart broke. What is the income ratio in the United States? Are we good at preventing people from falling into hopelessness and despair, or do we tend to not pay enough attention? And we have this massive problem where 1% of the people in the United States own more than the lower 92% or something like that in wealth that they have secured. That's what the United States is. Now, we could say we're the best at manufacturing and selling guns. We're the best at uh, having democratic elections. I don't know if we could make that argument at this point in history, but hopefully we clean that up. You could say some very real things that the United States is the best at, but it's not education. It's not healthcare. It's not equality. And again, these are things that sort of sting if you're a US citizen to hear, because we don't talk about things like this in the US. We usually hear the opposite: unquestionable, unquestioned patriotism with no specifics attached. And the reason there's no specifics is, number one, there aren't many. And number two, if they are specific, they'd be like greatest country ever at being known to have Mitsubishi subconsciously sell ecstasy tablets when you stamp it on there. That's not the sort of thing that makes us the best country ever. So it's worth thinking about too. I'm already revealing this a little bit. Why do we have a culture like this where it's so hard to talk about these things? Well, of course, it's our history. If you read the Constitution, you'll realize women don't exist in it. They weren't supposed to exist. If you're a woman, you weren't supposed to be able to vote, own land. If you want any voice at all, said the original US construction Constitution, you better marry a man and then tell him to speak for you. You be quiet. And of course, we all know about the Three-Fifths Compromise. Black folks also were in a very similar position where whatever clout they had in that compromise wasn't even theirs to exercise. It was the plantation owners who got to vote on their behalf. We've got a lot of this history, and you don't have to go back very far to see that it's still going on. There were 10 police officers recently convicted for torturing black men in their jurisdiction in the national news. And this is the sort of stuff that when we're like, I don't know, it's really hard to look it in the face. And most of us grow up with a nice, especially the middle to upper class white folks in the United States, with a nice cozy story that says, thank goodness for Martin Luther King Jr. All that stuff's fixed before I got here. There might be a few racisms still going on, but we're working on it. And that story is often incorrect. Oh my God, it feels so much better than acknowledging the truth. All right, some other things to think about. Day one, as we're just playing with culture, we're kicking around the idea of what's this class about. Imagine a president puts a 25% tariff on all steel coming into the United States. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Now, if we were in a class, I guarantee one or two people would raise their hand and say it's a good thing. One or two would raise their hand and say it's a bad thing. And then at the end, a couple would raise their hand and say, who cares? Think about positionality. If your dad works in the steel industry in the United States, this is a good thing. He's going to now probably get a raise. They're going to sell more steel because the imported steel is going to be more expensive. Let's say you own stock in a company that's not in the United States, or maybe you work for a company that's not in the United States. This could be a bad thing to you. And of course, most of you are students who couldn't care less if there's a tariff on steel. You're not going to buy a car anytime soon where it might cost an extra $300. Your positionality determines how you view issues in culture, not just through the lens of whether or not you understand what's going on from a certain perspective, but literally on whether or not you see it as a good or a bad thing. So it's worth on day one remembering when we feel challenged, or if we feel at times like maybe something we're talking about pushes directly at our group of people, that's what's going on here. It involves our positionality and our ability to see things from our past experience, from our perspectives. And again, this is the root of what this class is really about. All right, so basic stuff first day, be respectful of your peers. We're gonna have discussion boards. It's fine to push back, to ask questions, to add research to somebody's point. No reason to be insulting. That seems to just go without saying. Also, if you bump into things that are related to class content, something we've talked about, send it my way. A lot of times those things get shared and they become extra credit. And stay with me. I mentioned earlier, Zoom meetings are available whenever you need them. Let me know. Same line, accommodations. If you have official accommodations from disability services, please get them to me as soon as possible. And if you don't, but there are things that can be done with the class to make it more conducive to your learning style, feel free to reach out to me and we can see what we can do. Everything is on Canvas, no book required, but Remember this right now as you're hearing my voice. Every single week you have assignments due. And by week 4, 5, 8, and 10, we start to get into the real heart of this class where we're putting together the previous 4 to 5 weeks into a research type paper. So make sure you are doing the readings as you go and watching these lectures every week, and you'll be fine. We're going to talk through everything we need to know. Another good point about this class, quizzes most weeks. If there's a quiz on the Canvas page, be sure you take it in the time that it's due. But also take notes as you read these articles for 2 reasons. Number one, guaranteed it helps you remember things better, especially a week or a month later when you're trying to write a paper from an article you read 5 weeks ago. But also because if you don't get the grade you want on any quiz through the whole quarter, even if it's 1 point off or it's a 1 out of 10, whatever grade is not good enough for you, as long as you took the quiz on time and made a diligent effort, you can send me your reading notes and I will totally switch the grade based on how well your reading notes are done. All right, dialogue, discussion, and debate. The main difference between these is if you're debating with somebody, you're arguing. If you're discussing somebody, you're basically arguing but saying, I'm in a position of authority here, so I need to tell you the way it is. I don't agree with you, and that's it. You can say your piece, but sorry, you're still trying to get your point across. Dialogue, on the other hand, is talking to somebody you disagree with the sole intent of figuring out why they believe what they believe. Now, there's a valuable lesson to this, especially in the 2020s when the internet and social media has us all on our worst behavior. Well, there's 2, actually. Number one, it gives you a way to engage with people in a world where everybody seems to just want to own everybody else, treat everybody else awful, tell everybody else how wrong they are. And number 2, if your real goal is to convince somebody to change their mind, well, it would do you well to figure out what has them convinced of the thing you want them to change their mind on. So the benefit of meeting somebody who believes that, say, the earth is flat, and instead of saying, you're an idiot, or how can you believe that? Here's debate. Here's the stuff I know that shows me you're wrong. If we instead say, why do you believe that? Chances are we're going to get some information that is the central hub of what is supporting that false belief in somebody's mind. And then if we have the proper evidence, we can kick that support out and actually accomplish what we would want to accomplish anyway, which is to convince them we're right. So that's dialogue, discussion, and debate. And I want to stick with a dialogue perspective in this class, especially when it comes to writing these assignments. Think about reflective writing, which you're going to do every week in these discussion posts, as basically 2 to 5 sentences from an author that we're going to read, and then the rest of the paper is connecting that author's points to your life experience. It's you looking in the mirror and applying what you just read in a way that makes it attached to your life. Boots on the ground, as I like to say. This should be a class where we're not talking about faraway stuff, but we're all literally talking about our own individual experiences in the world and the way these theories help us make sense of it. Alternative formats, something I love in this class. You can click on the discussion posts and see what I mean by that. But if you want to do a podcast for an assignment, a zine, a PowerPoint, a video, anything like that, reach out to me a few days ahead of time and make sure we've got the specifics locked down. But I love those sorts of assignments, and they're way more enjoyable for students. The big assignments, I also don't mind if you do them in groups of probably no more than 3 if you're going to do a podcast. But as we move to the big projects on weeks 5, 8, and 10, those of you that have people in the class that you might think, hey, we could get together and do this together, another thing that helps students save a lot of time and energy. Not to overburden it, but again, reflective writing. When you talk about a theory or an idea that you've read from an author, including week 2, when you're going to be asked to talk about cultural identity and social identity, define those terms when you use them. Tell me where you found them and what the author said they mean. So according to Beverly Tatum, social identity is blah, 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 blah. And then attach that to your life after you do the first part. Make sure you follow this recipe of whenever you use a term or a theory, number 1, explain it, define it. Number 2, tell me how the heck you know, cite it. And then number 3, boots on the ground. Talk about how it impacts your life. All right, so some things that the first few weeks are really going to hit on You've got a video about the Dunning-Kruger effect, so maybe we'll pick this up a little next week after I'm sure everyone's watched that, and we'll discuss what that has to do as we move through this class. But the short story is, as you start to feel empowered and like you're learning things, don't let yourself be tricked into thinking, I got it now, because the Dunning-Kruger effect says that if that happens, you'll feel kind of down on week 5 or 6 when you start to realize, man, I have a lot left to learn. Expect in this class, though, you're going to realize not only is there a lot to learn about culture, but also that many of us that grew up in the United States were sort of tricked into not seeing any of it. So we've got a lot of learning to do. Social identity, something I want to introduce early in the class. We all that live in a huge country or a culture have a shared cultural identity. You might think of it as a capital C culture. And then some of us live in Kentucky, and some of us, like me, grew up on a dead end road in Michigan, and some of us lived in Detroit, and some of us lived in New York. We've all got like a small c cultural identity, and we get accents or figures of speech. You can order a pop in Michigan and get a soda, but if you order a pop down south, they'll look at you funny. They don't know what that is. And then below those two things, we've got your big C culture, your little c culture, like I grew up in Battle Creek, Michigan. We've got social identity, your individual, influenced by your small, close network of people and your experiences in your own life and how they interacted with the rest of the world. So another super quick day, week 1 definition of social identity. We're going to dive into that next week, but keep that centered in your mind. That is the theme of this class, is to, number 1, get a hold of who you are. Number 2, get a hold of what culture is and how or why we ought to learn about it. What can it give us to learn about it? And then number 3, talk about how those two things give you a way to look at your old culture versus the new one you're going to. What can you expect to encounter? What challenges might you bump into? What things might feel like safe ground to you because they're similar to the culture you come from? Things like that. All right. Another question I want to bring up a few times this semester: segregated schools in the United States. Most of you probably thinking, no, of course I didn't go to a segregated school. It was the 2000s. What are you talking about? If you think about it, you probably did. And the majority of schools in the United States are still technically segregated, just not by law. Think about what you would have pop into your mind if I said there's a school that's all white kids. We're going to desegregate it. In your mind, you would probably think we're going to have multiple religions represented. There's going to be a representative population of whatever other groups of people are living in the area. It'll be much more diverse. You wouldn't think, I think there was a couple of black folks that went there, but only certain ones. That's not what we traditionally think of as desegregation. And we're 60 years now out of the decision that allegedly desegregated schools in the United States. It's worth us thinking about, again, why is U.S. culture so invisible, and why do we have a hard time putting our thumb on it sometimes? Another example. All right. My background, going back to some of the stuff I talked about at the beginning of class, you can look sometimes at subcultures, small c cultures in the United States, like prison, like the drug using communities on the streets, like homeless communities, like religious organizations. You can look at these small groups sometimes and see that even in the United States, you will find something operating very different than what the norm is. So a good example is big C culture, United States, capital C, the whole country is capitalist and individualist. We're taught, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, make sure you can pay your own way. It's shameful to have to take handouts, things like that. And then you find groups of people like Amish folks who are very collectivist right in the middle of these groups, and they think in an incredibly different way. And they're there for us to, if we would like, to get a snapshot of how programmed we are in our cultural identities and how different it can be right next door, sometimes without us noticing. So again, some basic week 1 things to think about. All you've got to do on this week 1, aside from watching this boring lecture that's now almost done, is complete the discussion post and then read or watch the Dunning-Kruger video. Super easy week. The discussion post is just an introduction. Hi, here's who I am. Get us in the habit of playing through Canvas. Read the syllabus, make sure you understand what's expected of you. Send me an email if you have any questions. And then next week, you'll have a similar lecture style video just like this and some more assignments. Make sure that you are using the assigned articles every week to complete the assigned discussion post. The heart and the meat of your points in this class comes from really showing that you've read and engaged with the articles and that you can apply what you've read and engaged with to your own life, to your own cultural identity, and to your own travel abroad experience. Again, send me an email if you're struggling with anything in the class. Get in the habit of that, and welcome to the class.